Okay, so the monologue is going to have three parts. The first part is some very, very high level, simple explanations of what Epicurus and Avicenna teach about the nature of God. We'll start with Epicurus, since he is the ancient. He comes just after the big three that we finished in time. And his philosophy was most popular in the Hellenistic era. What he taught about God was that God was powerful, all powerful even, and that he was happy, all happy, or most perfectly happy of individuals. And because Epicurus taught those two things and believed those two things, he said that God could not be angry or jealous or disappointed, because that would conflict with his fundamental nature of happiness and powerfulness. And anger or jealousy or disappointment would be a weak response, and a response that was involving displeasure and not pleasure, and he saw God as a perfectly pleasurable being. Furthermore, he kind of threw out the pantheon idea, the old Greek gods. He rather controversially said that the existence of a god was evident through common sense. And he didn't explain what common sense would make it evident. He just said it's obvious there is a God. But then he said all of these further speculations we have about the gods and about what the gods like and dislike, or what the gods desire us to do, all of that is speculation. And furthermore, it's speculation that's not in conformity with the identity of God being powerful and happy. Therefore, he threw it all out. He didn't really believe in the pantheon. He didn't really subscribe to all of the pagan ideologies that ancient Greeks around him would have subscribed to. So he wasn't so firm on it being a monotheism. He wasn't so firm on there only being one God. He just said common sense dictated there was a God, and furthermore, that God's fundamental nature was powerful and happy, or all pleasure and no displeasure. That's what Epicurus taught about God, and that was a basis for most of his further philosophies on life. Avicenna was a Muslim philosopher, one of the preeminent Muslim philosophers of the Middle Ages. Obviously a genius, because he wrote the most influential work on medicine that would be for several hundred years. And whenever he would talk about medicine, he would talk about how easy that subject was. It was a trivial subject. So we see some of his genius there. He just innately understood many things that many others didn't innately understand. He also got to read Aristotle, and he loved Aristotle and Plato, probably whenever they were near Egypt and near Alexandria. He came into contact with those texts. And he loved their style. So what he did was he used the style of logic and rhetoric that he saw there to prove many of the axioms that were taught by Muslim theologians. When it came to God, he postulated a proof of God, and that proof of God is one of the most influential proofs of God that has ever been in the history of the world. It went on to be used by most of the following Muslim philosophers, and also by most of the following Christian philosophers through the rest of the Middle Ages. And it's called, shorthand, the proof of the truthful. Essentially, it's this: all of everything that exists can be separated into that which exists necessarily, or that which exists unnecessarily. Of the things that exist unnecessarily, they either exist because they are predicated on other unnecessary things, or they exist because they are predicated on a necessary thing. He then goes on to prove that if the thing that's possible if the thing that exists unnecessarily exists on other things that exist unnecessarily, there must be a final terminus in something that exists necessarily. If it's something that exists necessarily, then it cannot count its existence from some external thing. So it can't be something else that allows it to exist unnecessarily, to exist necessarily, because if it was dependent on something else, it couldn't be a necessary existent. He follows down those lines of logic until he comes to the undeniable fact that for anything to exist at all, whether it's necessary or unnecessary, there has to exist one thing that is necessary, and necessary in and of its own properties, not in and of any other properties. And he gets to that conclusion because he follows all of his lines of logic down to their terminus. He keeps going deeper and deeper until you come to the fact that there must be something that exists necessarily, and not only does it exist necessarily, it exists necessarily with no dependence on any external thing. So the necessary existent, in this case, for Avicenna, is God. Like I said, it's called the proof of the truthful. And it was just before, and as far as time goes, that was postulated just before, a number of years before Aquinas. And either it influenced Aquinas' position, or it was similar to what Aquinas came up with simultaneously. But in either case, everything that came after Aquinas, everything that came after Avicenna was influenced by this proof of the truthful. That's the end of the first part. So we explained a little bit of what Epicurus taught about the nature of God, and a little bit about what Avicenna taught as the nature of God. In the second part, we're going to run through a fable that I'm going to postulate to y'all. The first of Eleazar's fables, if you will. In this fable, we have a puppy. Now, the puppy loves to run. It started with walking, and it enjoyed walking. And then it started running, and it enjoyed running. And so most of its time, most of its days, it pursued those activities. One day, however, while it was running, the puppy tripped, took a tumble, and it hurt. It physically hurt when he fell. And he stopped running, which is what he loved to do. It stopped him from running. When the puppy got up, it looked to see what had tripped him, and it was a root protruding from the ground. The puppy prepared itself to keep running. But before it could, the root asked the puppy a question. The root asked, "Why did you strike me?" The puppy was very confused by this and replied, "What do you mean, why did I strike you? You tripped me. You stopped me from running. I fell and it hurt. How can you ask me, why did I strike you? You tripped me." To which the root replies, "How can you think that you lost? How can you think that you were the one that was hurt? I was here, and you struck me. You are the one who is at fault, and you're the one who should answer." The puppy then replied, "Well, root, if I am at fault, then that means that I'm responsible for you being a root, and you being in my way, and you getting in the path of my running. And I know I'm not responsible for that. I was just running, and running is what I love to do, and I was born to do that." The root replied, "You seem to think that I have a great degree of freedom. And I suppose I do have some freedom after a fashion. I am free to till the earth. I am free to drink the earth's water. But the truth is, I only go where the great tree has led me to go. I only till the earth that is full of nutrients, and I only drink the water that gives the life back to the great tree. And I know that if I were to not till the earth here, and if I were to not draw the nutrients from the earth and the water from the ground, that the great tree would cut me off. So truly, I did not choose to be here. It was you who chose to run over me. The puppy was confused at this point. The puppy knew that it liked to run, and the puppy knew that he had great pleasure in his frolicking. But when he was confronted by this root, and by evidently the pain that he had caused the root, he was confused, because his tripping had hurt him, and his tripping had hurt the root. But then the puppy had a different thought, and the puppy replied to the root, "But isn't this a good thing for us both? Because in my tripping over you, root, or in my striking you, root, even though that caused us both pain, it led us to speak to each other. It led us into this conversation, which is one of the best conversations I can remember having. Indeed, I feel as if I know you, root, and I would never have known you without tripping. We could be friends, root, and this could all be worth the pain." The root replied, "Once more you are making assumptions. Once more you assume that I desired to speak to you in this manner, and that I desired to continue on speaking to you. You assume that I desire your friendship, and you assume that the pain that you caused me was incomparable to the gain we had from this conversation." At this point, the puppy grew tired of the conversation, and the puppy decided he wasn't enjoying the talk. So the puppy ran on, and the root stayed, and the root tilled, and the root drank water. That's the fable, or at least the first draft of the fable. As I said before, I didn't really finish that, except extemporaneously. Now we'll go on to the third part of the monologue. In the third part, I'd like to draw two connections that struck me as I was thinking about these two philosophers this month. The first is that Epicureans seem to have much in common with the stereotype of a modern day millennial. The Epicureans believe in God, and the millennials do believe in God, or at least a spiritualism. Both Epicureans and millennials think that is very disconnected from life, that the God is a lofty God, and that people are pretty much left on their own. And there are other reasons I could say that millennials are similar to Epicureans that we can discuss further after the monologue. But then to draw a connection to Avicenna, the only thing I could draw connections to is actually the science of computer science. How Avicenna approached even the idea of God was an extensive, iterative, and not rhetorically sensical methodology of defining parameters and defining subcategories within the parameters and interactions between the subcategories, and then drawing out to first principles and even to, even to a idea of the good kind of principle that says there's a necessary existent. And his methodology just struck me as very much in line with computer scientists. So I saw similarities between computer scientists in Avicenna and millennials and Epicurus. We can discuss that further in our discussions. But that is the end of the monologue.
Like this week, asked a question without asking any questions. That is, what does the fable mean?
That's what I was thinking too. Can we ask you questions, Stephen?
Of course, yeah, and we can discuss it.
In your
I'm very
mind,
interested
what
in a free discussion for this particular set of
okay.
critical thinking questions.
In your mind, what does the root represent? If this is a fable or parable of sorts, what does the root represent from your perspective?
Where the fable began, in my mind, was with the roots as Avicenna, and with the puppy as Epicurus.
Oh. Where did it end, if that's where it began?
As I was writing the fable, and like I said, I haven't truly finished writing the fable, I noticed a tendency within my own mind to ascribe a couple of attributes from Epicureans to the root, just a couple, not big ones, but a couple of attributes of Epicureans to the root, and then a couple attributes of the Muslim philosophy to the puppy, even though that was not the intent when I started out. And I decided not to fight that too much because I felt like I was still true to the original spirit I set out in.
I think it turned out to be more of a interesting moral dilemma.
Why is that?
Well, of course, at first glance, the fable being a sort of lesson on blame or fault, maybe. And it's probably an interesting lesson, although I was considering that perhaps the Avicenna and Epicurus, I did think that that might have been what you were going for. Characters as well. And it's interesting to think how that kind of plays out. But I like the little moral dilemma. I appreciate the kind of confused nature of two separate entities conflicting with one another, and somehow that being a intractable problem, you know.
Yeah, in that way, I think it's very similar to the parables of Jesus. I mean, it's not a ready, cut and dry answer. It makes you think, and I like that. It's very much making me think right now.
One thing I wanted to be very particular about was the puppy was playing and the root was working. And that was really important to my designing of the fable.
So we could take the cut and dry approach and ask you what you think, or we could ask you, is it purposeful that the parable doesn't seem to state whether playing or working is good or bad? They're both kind of doing their thing. Is that what you meant to say?
I don't know if I want to say what I meant to say until a little later.
Yeah, I'm not asking you what you think. I'm more asking what the story says at face value. The story at face value doesn't seem to say that either playing or working is a bad thing. From a
True.
certain perspective, they're both the same thing and both necessary.
True. The story doesn't condemn or condone either.
Yeah, I was feeling like that particular detail was not paramount, or at least it's not paramount to anything that I can think of.
Well, all details.
It's more of an important character trait. It's more of like, here's who the puppy is, what the root is. So in that way, in a fable manner, you can relate these kind of odd characters back to the real world. Without that, you wouldn't be able to have any sort of application. So of course it's important and maybe necessary, but I didn't take that as a additional meaning beyond what I've just mentioned.
Just personification.
Right.
Well, here's a question I have. Are the root as well as the puppy both engaging in a pleasurable act?
That is a great question.
Is it an act that brings them both pleasure?
I'm glad that that's a question you asked. I tried to make it plain that one of them is seeking pleasure. But yeah, in my opinion, it's quite possible for them both to be gaining pleasure.
That tells me a lot.
I think they both would be gaining the equal measure of pleasure, although it might not be orally equal.
Well then, Jacob, in your opinion, which one's pleasure lasts longer?
I think the root's pleasure would be intrinsically more stable, or perhaps over time. Being, by the nature of work and rewards and such. If an entity is created for a particular purpose, then fulfilling that purpose by the nature of the entity created for that purpose will be fulfilling for the entity. So the root, in so much as it can bring nourishment to it, it's almost like intrinsically, it just has to be receiving some sort of reward or pleasure for that. So, maybe over time it grows and gets better and
Well, alright. There's a third character in this fable. There's the puppy, there's the root, and there's the tree. So the puppy and the root are Epicurus and Avicenna. What or who is the tree?
Oh, I think I'll let you and Jacob talk about it before I just like say everything I wanted it to be. I'd rather find out what it was from y'all than just say what I wanted it to be.
Okay. I mean, besides what I think is correct from the fable, I kind of got the idea that the tree is the overarching guiding principle of existence, the absolute truth, the truth that is overshadowing everything. And the root is connected to that and is seeking to fulfill the tree's desires or needs. At least that's what I thought the fable thought. Whether I think that's an absolutely correct way of approaching it in the real world or not is neither here nor there, but I think that's what the fable was trying to say, in my opinion, at least.
Brandon just guessed at what the tree was.
Ah.
Did you hear that, Jacob? Were your headphones on your ears?
A deity, perhaps?
Or not even necessarily a deity, a good, an overarching good, a good that permeates everything and makes everything meaningful.
Well, I'm not sure. Could go on to perhaps other questions, or
I think we could go way deeper here.
we probably can. I
think
just
we need
don't
to say
know
the first thing that
anything
comes to
else.
our minds. I think we need to not judge our thoughts, and we need to speak whatever we think.
Okay, maybe I can ask questions about it if you want to talk about it a little more.
Yes, please. Jacob, what do you think?
Fine with that.
Okay, so here's a question. What was the nature of the disagreement?
Who struck whom?
It was the assumptions of which actions were proper, or good. Root assumed that the puppy should not be, perhaps, running carelessly. Puppy assumed that the root should not be there in its way while it was running carelessly.
Did they come to an understanding?
No.
I think there was more understanding there than they didn't come to an agreement, but they certainly understood one another's positions. I think the root maybe understood the puppy more than the puppy understood the root. The puppy seemed confused, kind of gave up. Whereas the root was like, kind of arguing from a coherent standpoint. It's like, I'm a root, here's what I'm doing, I'm here. Obviously, existing can't be my fault.
There's another way we could look at this. Besides the root and the puppy representing what what Eleazar wanted them to represent, the root could represent a person of faith. The puppy could represent a person of existence, a person who just simply exists and doesn't necessarily set any particular aim for their actions. whereas the root has a specific aim, which is serving the tree.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because that certainly came to mind when he was telling the story.
I think people who exist trip over people who have a specific aim all of the time. I mean, if I were to meet a Muslim on the street who says that if you don't throw out your prayer rug and pray towards Mecca 5 times a day and confess that there is one God and his name is Allah, blessed is he, then you're damned. That's a stumbling root for me. Or as the Christians would call it, a stumbling block. So it's a very profound parable. Very, very well written, Stephen. Well done.
Thank you for saying so. I know it wasn't worded optimally.
No, that's the best parables are written by shepherds. It's very well written.
I'm happy that y'all saw that as well, because I did want it to be kind of a person of faith, a person of the world situation. And furthermore, I wanted the point of the story to be seemingly meaningless conflict. Because that is honestly what I feel I see perpetuated by the Epicurean beliefs of millennials. Is they're just drawn towards meaningless conflict. And then a person of faith, even if it doesn't matter what faith that person is much better grounded than the person of the world. It's easy for them to win a logical argument.
And this still goes deeper because you could argue that even the person of existence, and I'm calling them a person of existence because I feel that the puppy, which I think we have all kind of tacitly agreed is a millennial, agrees that existence is the main thing they want to do. They just want to exist. They want to love existence. But in what do they place their leaning? Upon what do they stake their claim? They have to stake their claim on something, and maybe the parable hints at that. Maybe it doesn't. I mean, maybe the puppy representing the person of existence or the person of the world doesn't stake their claim on anything. And that in itself is something. I don't know. We just have to decide what that is and how to define exactly what that looks like.
I guess one last question is about all I could think of. But what did y'all think of the little rabbit hole or rabbit trail that the puppy started to go down with building a relationship or having a friendship?
The only thing I remember feeling was that it was very surprising that the root didn't want to engage in that.
I think that's just because you expect stories to have nice, happy endings.
No.
Where everyone's friends and gets along.
Very incorrect. Some of my favorite stories have very troublesome and sad endings.
But isn't that the only reason why your mind would be like, oh, they're gonna be friends? Like, you know. Isn't that the only reason for the surprise there?
No, the more reason for that is I want the story to tell me how to live correctly, Jacob. And the story doesn't necessarily tell me how to live correctly when we take into account all of the representations that we have postulated as possible. Because of the actions that the story entered into. The fact that they didn't become friends, and the fact of what we interpreted as representative of who those roots and dogs were doesn't help us very much. So that leaves a big question mark. Probably the biggest question mark. Why did they not become friends? Or at least acquaintances.
Did they have anything to offer one another?
Absolutely.
In what way would the root accomplish its mission better if it were friends with the puppy? In what way would the puppy enjoy its running better if it were friends with the root?
This is where we get to the point where stories have their failing point. While the story is an excellent fable, it doesn't fit well into reality at this point. Because from the perspective of reality, I could give you many reasons. But from the perspective of the story, no reasons.
I take that as intentional.
But not necessarily helpful.
What if
Definitely
you provided fertilizer?
Well, exactly, and there are situations where the characters chosen could be of a synergistic nature, right? So that's a sort of thing where it's like, the author here could have chosen characters to where they should have been friends but weren't. In this way, Stevens made it even more meaningless, right? He's made it even more of an unuseful conflict. It's just pointless. And again, that's kind of the core of it. So that's kind of what I think of your little rabbit trail. It's like, let's try to make something happen here. Let's try to resolve this story in a way that seems right to the readers, whether that's a happy ending or whether that's a meaningful ending, to where we have a prescription of morality or a lesson of morality. But instead, you say, nope, you don't get that. This was all pointless. All of this was Hevel.
So maybe it's a type of performance art to show us how useless postmodernism is. And the fact that we need a meaning? I don't know.
It's hard to relate it back to postmodernism directly, but
Oh, not hard at all. Quite easy.
boy.
I've got to speak for Jonathan while he's not here. So,
Oh no.
Jonathan,
I'm
don't
not
think
sure
anyone
that any
can
of
do
us
that.
is capable.
I don't think anyone can do that.
that's true. I don't think I'm capable, but I'm trying, Jonathan. Please understand.
He would have hated my fable, I'm sure.
Which is why I'm trying to speak for him. I'm sorry. I will try, but I will probably fail.
I did really want. I wanted the answers to the questions: who was likable in the story, who was positive in the story, who was optimistic in the story, who was virtuous in the story, who was the good guy. I wanted the answers to each of those questions to be like different. Like they don't center on
Or
one
just
thing.
ambiguous.
They like, yeah.
Well, are you asking us to answer those questions right now?
Well, you can. I mean, you can also just answer them for yourselves. I don't know if discussion will enrich those answers.
Okay, yeah. Good point.
I think we can move on from that if y'all are good.
Sure.
Okay. I guess I will ask one more question and then we'll move on to the old stuff. So it was not included in the reading, but the principal doctrines of Epicurus, there was one of them in particular that just stood out to me so much. And even though I was saying Epicureans are like millennials, because I do see many strong similarities, there's this one doctrine, Doctrine 24, that seems to be poking at the fragility of millennial philosophy, I guess, or millennial perspectives. So I'll read it. Principal Doctrine of Epicurus, number 24. If you reject absolutely any single sensation without stopping to discriminate with respect to that which awaits confirmation between matter of opinion and that which is already present, whether in sensation or in feeling or in any immediate perception of the mind, you will throw into confusion even the rest of your sensations because of your groundless belief. And so you will be rejecting the standard of truth altogether. If in your ideas, based upon opinion, you hastily affirm true all that awaits confirmation, as well as all that which does not, you will not escape error, as you will be maintaining complete ambiguity whenever it is a case of judging between right and wrong opinion.
That's hilarious.
This is an amazing doctrine to me.
It's amazing. Yes, it
I
is.
don't understand how it was Epicurus's doctrine, honestly. This sticks out like a sore thumb on everything else I read from Epicurus. And it seems more true also than the rest of what I read from him. I had a question about this.
I don't know if it's necessarily more true. Because from my perspective, that seemed to be saying the basis for truth was a sensory experience. Do we necessarily submit to that?
Well, what it really seems to be saying, in my opinion, and I'll be honest, I'd read it many times before I was really very certain of my opinion on it, is that if you reject an idea for no reason, and then accept other ideas for no reason, you will have destroyed your own standard of truth. And every time you come up against decisions and right and wrong situations, you're not going to be able to answer correctly. So essentially, if you live an unexamined life, if you just accept some things for no reason and deny some things for no reason, like, you're doomed, essentially.
The best part of his philosophy was bummed off of his forebears. The unexamined life was not worth living.
Essentially.
Yeah, pretty complicated way of saying you need a basis.
Yeah. Yep. But it doesn't seem to go with anything else that I read from him, because he says that God exists via common sense, and then doesn't explain the common sense. And he says that everything we know about God's is wrong because it's assumptions. And then he says that you need to live your life avoiding all displeasure, because that's the best life you can live. God lives with zero displeasure. So if you can live with minimal displeasure, you're living the most virtuous life you can. And then he says stuff like the best way to minimize your displeasure and maximize your pleasures is to have good friends you spend lots of time with.
Oh, this is good. Okay.
But all of it is groundless. He doesn't support any of it. And I don't know of a logical framework that can be used to support all of his views in tandem. But this doctrine is saying you need a framework. You need a basis. So it's funny to me that it's there.
Can I ask my critical thinking question now?
Yeah, I'm good with all my things.
Okay. But I don't ask that lightly. It's related to what you just said. Assuming that the root represents a person of faith and the puppy represents a person of existence, what in essence do we define as the definitions of pleasure according to the root and according to the puppy? How do they differ? How do they conflict? What are the aims of each of their pleasure? Because I'm making the assertion by asking this question that pleasure is not the problem. In fact, pleasure is a very, very, very good thing. So it has to be a difference of definition, in my opinion. How do they define it, and who's wrong?
Well, your characters kind of answer your question for you. If you have one character who is of religious standing, then he believes in a higher existence, that a deity is existing beyond the scope of his finite realm. Kind of the nature of religion. So if that's the case, then this higher existing being gets to determine what pleasure is.
Okay, okay, that's very good. But what happens if the person who is a person of faith?
Signal drop.
Are you here?
Your signal dropped. What was it?
Okay, let's say the person who is a person of faith believes that instead of a deity, there is a higher law code that is their deity of sorts, their quote unquote the good. It is the good that they fall in line with.
Okay.
How does that work?
Well, does that make any difference?
Well,
So you're saying
if it,
if the God was a system and not just an entity?
yeah, if the God is a system of thought and not just an entity, what would that look like? And I'm playing
Well, the
slight.
religious person would still believe that living in accordance to whatever system that is will bring about the most pleasure, whether it does or not. Like in the physical sense, I suppose I should clarify.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to say in the physical sense.
Yeah, and whether it's a real afterlife or some sort of spiritual fulfillment, or whether it actually doesn't exist because they're working off false pretenses, I think that living in according to their beliefs will just be the most. So I guess here to answer your question, because you're saying and who was wrong, here the religious person has the potential to be wrong if their beliefs are not, in fact, in alignment with reality.
Yeah, I guess I am saying that, but I'm also getting more into the details of the exact feelings of their pleasure. When do they feel pleasure? How do they feel pleasure? What causes them to feel pleasure? And how does that differ between the two?
If you take a super scientific and simple definition of pleasure, something like consistent dopamine responses, so a chemical response within the body, and call that dopamine response pleasure, so a specific pleasure response within the body, then I guess if you go to the parable, you'd say that the pleasure of the root is very limited in its scope. The root will be where it is and do what it is doing, and nothing else. That is the scope of its pleasure. However, the puppy has at least wider bounds, if not as boundless. It will go and do whatever to pursue its pleasure. So that's one thing.
Hmm.
It also suggests that the puppy is pursuing pleasure, literally, and the root is pursuing something other than pleasure, even if it's receiving pleasure.
But is that necessarily true? Because the root knows that if it doesn't pursue pleasure, it will die because the tree will die. That doesn't make any sense in accordance with the story.
Now, the story specifically says that the root can be cut off and the tree still exist.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and this is where things get very difficult in accordance with reality.
The assumption is
The
that
root,
there are many, many other roots, or the roots can be replaced.
In accordance with reality, the parables that have already been stated historically need to be paramount, in that the root should be a branch.
You mean consistent with biblical parables?
Yes.
But why does this parable need to be consistent with biblical parables?
Well, if the root / branch, whatever we want to call it,
I want to call it root.
All right. Well, whatever. I will call it a branch then. If the branch doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it will be cut off. And the branches that are doing what they're supposed to do, receiving sunlight, undergoing photosynthesis, bringing nutrients to the trunk of the tree, then that branch will live.
Well, all that means, as far as the difference goes, is that the puppy is pursuing pleasure, and the branch or the root is pursuing life.
Is not life pleasure? And the lack of life displeasurable?
Not according to Epicurus at all, because Epicurus is teaching on the afterlife is that when you cease to exist, you can no longer suffer. So he says ceasing to exist is actually, it's not a bad thing or a good thing, it's a moot point. Epicurus says you just need to minimize all suffering while you're alive. That's
Well,
Epicurus.
that's a load of crap.
Yeah, I don't think highly of Epicurus, but I think his views are more widely shared than I knew before starting to study this.
Here's why I think that's a load of crap. I won't just say it's a load of crap without actually thinking about it, and then I'll let Jacob say something. Sorry, I'm talking too much. It's problematic to me to assume that a being with deep consciousness, the ability to feel pleasure, the ability to think things through, should necessarily stop doing such at the point that their physical body ceases to be active. That seems problematic to me. And I think pleasure itself is one of the most viable communications of this. I mean, when you think of a dog, the dog wants to eat, wants to drink, because it wants to live. The dog wants to release itself in the backyard because it wants to guard its territory from other dogs. When you compare that behavior to the behavior of a human, it seems inherently different. The human wants to eat because it wants to move beyond however it has existed prior to that point. If it loves pleasure, that is. The human wants to drink because it is dissatisfied with the mode of being it's been in up to that point. The human wants to go on a walk because it wants to see all of the things around it that give life meaning. The dog doesn't seem to evidence this kind of thought.
And yet dogs love walks and food and drink.
Yes, and what I'm saying is that the loving of drink and food and walks is inherently different between the two. And maybe that is the kernel of my critical thinking question. There are two types of pleasure here. How are they different? Because they are. We know they're different. We see that they're different, but we're not quite certain how they're different, although we inherently realize they are different. And Jonathan at this point would say, why are we talking about animals? And I'd say, well, it's very important why we're talking about animals, because if we don't talk about animals, all of the people who really are puppies in the world and Epicureans will not understand that there is something deeper than just being a puppy.
So instead of playing devil's advocate, we now play Jonathan's advocate.
Not to say that Jonathan is the devil,
No,
but that
not
Jonathan is very right in considering all of these things.
Brandon's doing both, not simultaneously.
yeah. But sometimes you're devil's advocate, sometimes you're Jonathan's advocate.
I'm not really sure if Brandon's.
I'm very here. I'm very much here.
I do hope Jonathan comes back and listens to all this.
Yes, please. And chastises me for incorrectly playing Jonathan's advocate.
Or Jack Barton, I suppose we should say.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
But does
I
that
don't
make any
know.
sense what I'm trying to say? Does that make any sense, or am I needing to define it better?
I don't know if I can answer your question. Because you say that they're different, and you say that they're obviously different, like evidently different to you and presumably to everyone. They're evidently different. But from a philosophical standpoint, I'm struggling to see the difference.
Well, I am as well, which is why I'm asking someone else who has the philosophical desire or acumen to state the difference, because I think it's possible. I really do think it's possible to state that in a way that is clear. I just don't feel able to do it. I mean, if I had more time to sit in a room and think about it, maybe I could. But I think it's really the deep kernel of this fable as well.
So the
Because,
difference in pleasure between the root and the puppy.
yeah, I think that's the most important thing.
All right. If you really want to go down that road, we have a number of difficulties. First of all, saying that there are different sorts of pleasure does not make it so. There is pleasure, and Stephen defined it in one simple way. You could define it differently, but ultimately, if you want to assert that the root has a certain pleasure and the puppy has a certain different pleasure, then we should go ahead and make different words for them, try and work out what each of them are. However, I don't want to go down that road because I assert that they actually do have the same sorts of pleasure, and one of them is perhaps capable of receiving such and the other is not. And this is where what I was trying to get at in my initial response to your initial question is that if the root is right in his religious thinking, he gets eternal pleasure, which is infinitely more pleasurable than the puppy. On a whole different playing field. If the puppy's right, puppy's going to have a better life. It's a puppy. It's not in the ground. It's not like dirt. It's better than dirt. It's living, it's breathing, it's running around, it's active. With food, it can enjoy all the things that an animal can enjoy without enumerating them. That's my answer.
Okay, this is really good. That's really good.
Can I tidbit something before you reply?
Sure.
I just want to say, Epicurus addresses very long displeasures and pleasures. And he says unequivocally, I know it's nonsense, but unequivocally, that if you have a really long displeasure, that is a very large amount of displeasure. But if you have a really long amount of pleasure, you don't notice it because it's so long and consistent. So it's not very much pleasure. So an infinite, like Epicurus would hate the idea of living eternally. So the puppy would hate the idea of living eternally because even if it's a pleasant existence, without like the displeasures that you're trying to minimize, partitioning the pleasure, he wouldn't see the enjoyment of it. He would just think it was consistent stimulus, which is not the same as pleasure to him. So Epicurus would hate that.
The interesting part here is that's just being human-centric. That's just saying what we know as pleasure and displeasure is the ultimate truth.
Mm-hmm.
Let's base everything off of that.
Oof. Okay, well, aside from all of that, what's interesting to me is that the actions that cause the pleasure don't necessarily seem as important as the aims and goals at which the pleasure is directed. So maybe we think of the difference between the root's goal and aim and the puppy's aim and goal. Maybe that's what determines the long lastingness and the real quality and verity of each's pleasure. Uh, I can say more, but I want to hear thoughts to that particular postulation.
Well, the puppy's goal is to run, obviously. I think the puppy experiences success in each moment of running. So like it achieves its goal each moment. I am not certain about the root. I think the root's like what it's trying to do seems more long term. And it doesn't seem like the root thinks it's, accomplished its goal each moment. It's more like something that is built. And Jacob even said earlier, maybe it grows. Maybe it's accumulating. So one difference could be that the puppy's just trying to run and it is succeeding each moment that it's running, which is why I was upset when it stopped running. Or the root is trying to do something that's bigger and longer, and that's why the root was upset when it was like interrupted.
So it's the difference between short-term and long-term goals from Stephen's perspective.
Sure.
All right. Jacob?
I really don't have anything further to add from my response.
Was my question adequate? Do I need to elaborate?
Well, I mean, it still just comes down to even what I said in my first response. If the root is right, then the root's pleasure is superior. And in terms of the parable, all that means is that the tree, the great tree, whatever Stephen called it, has some is a better existence, is an ultimate good, is a deity basically. And the root seems to be treating the tree in that way by serving it. Although it's a root, so it doesn't really have any other choice. But I'd say, the same is true for humans if humans are indeed created by God. So it just comes down to who's right.
Who knows that? Well, at that point, I have said as much as I could say. We have hit up against the existential beyond, in my opinion. I can tell you what I believe, and I can tell you what I logically postulate, and what I logically postulate is hardly adequate. What I believe carries me past death. What I logically postulate carries me until about 3 weeks before I die, and then at that point, I have to start thinking very clearly of my death.
Well, I suppose then I could ask a question.
Exactly.
Ibn Sina spends a lot of time discussing metaphysical topics, and probably because he loved Aristotle. What I find interesting is he goes into great detail about the soul, which is kind of the fundamental metaphysical question: what is the soul? And yeah, Aristotle goes into great detail as well. Pretty much a whole book on it. And they each kind of describe all of these attributes that go into the soul: what it is, does it exist after, separate from the body, how it interacts with current finite situation. And there's probably some differences there, although I couldn't enumerate them if you asked. And that's not at all where my question's going. My question asks if there are fundamentally different underlying beliefs which lead each, or what are the fundamental or underlying beliefs that cause each, well, really Avicenna, to come up with all of these attributes of the soul. So where he spends a whole book describing all his stuff about the soul. And as best I could tell, he's just saying so, right? So where are all those coming from? And is such a standpoint better or worse than, we'll just say, Aristotle's standpoint? Or is it different?
This one's way above my pay grade. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to bow out for this one.
Oh, I believe in you, Brandon. At least a little bit. It's a good question. I suggested that Avicenna was a genius in my monologue. And as an example of that, I listed his book on the body and medicine, which became the standard textbook for several hundred years. Now, there's a thing with Muslim philosophers of this time, and particularly with Avicenna, that they seem extremely proud and boastful whenever us Westerners read them. And apparently that's actually a stylistic thing. It was very common in the Muslim culture at the time, that if you didn't state things with this like affirmative, self-authoritative verbiage, that it wasn't taken the right way. So we could start answering your question by saying he spoke as if he was right, because that was the way you had to speak in the literary tradition. And you're asking where all that came from. The other thing I'll say about Avicenna is that he was a Muslim. And even his Proof of the Truthful, his most famous philosophical work, was almost perfectly in accordance with all of the Muslim teachings. The prophetic words of Muhammad and just the Quran. So if I had to venture an answer, I'd say that he pulls all of these descriptors of the soul or attributes of the soul, parts of the soul, from first his reading of the Quran, and then from second, his own sense of genius. He claimed to understand the entire human body and called it simple. Now, he obviously didn't, because he died of an overdose on medicine he gave himself to try and cure his sickness. So, like, we know he wasn't as much of a genius as he thought he was, but I think he was self-confident enough, proud enough to read his Bible, the Quran, and then say what was true, that didn't contradict that, and that worked in his own mental framework. So I would say his source was himself, because he, unlike, say, Muhammad, never claimed to be a prophet or receive words from God. He claimed intellect.
Yeah.
And borrowed the systems of the Greeks to build a system for the Muslims.
Well, that's certainly not hard to imagine.
High-level answer. Better with high-level answers, though. Maybe you have thoughts on that, Brandon?
Well, Jacob's question had a few sub-questions to it that I don't feel qualified to answer. Jacob, state it again, please.
The question without framing is, where did Avicenna's opinions on the soul, statements on the soul, stem from, and are they better or worse? Are the stemming point, right? What's actually causing this? The better or worse basis than, say, Aristotle's? Stephen has asserted at this point that that point is simply himself, Avicenna.
Yeah, I think we can agree with Stephen's point and go a step further and postulate that perhaps the soul doesn't exist at all, on the basis of the fact that this opinion came from Avicenna himself. And if Avicenna based his selfhood opinion upon Aristotle, why are we to necessarily agree that Aristotle didn't base this on logical proofs? Couldn't Aristotle have necessarily made this from his own opinions as well? How do we know we even have souls? What even is a soul? I mean, how does the reading of a text on the soul even help existence? We can read a text on the soul and have wasted an entire day where we could have made the world a better place.
There's one other thing I could point out. You could say that Avicenna had a measuring stick that he used as his check and balance, and that would be the Quran. That was his measuring stick he checked himself against as he created this system from himself. And then if we go to Aristotle, then you also have to say that he created it himself. And if he had a measuring stick, I suppose you'd have to say it was Plato and Socrates. If he had a measuring stick that he checked himself against. I'm not sure how good a comparison that is, though, because Aristotle did seem willing to contradict Plato and Aristotle, or Plato and Socrates at various times and places. So as far as which one is better goes, you could say that Aristotle's is better because he's not checking himself against a religious text, or you could say that Avicenna is better because he is checking himself against a religious text.
Yeah. About right. Well, I think I'm happy with that answer.
That seems good. Well, we've had our questions and we've gone through everything we need to, and that can conclude.
All right.